September 20th, 1943. The Texas sun beat down on the long metal body of a troop train as it hissed and moaned to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Dust rose in small storms beneath its wheels, curling around boots, skirts, and rifles. The first to step down were not men, but women, thin, pale, exhausted shapes wrapped in what had once been the gray-green uniforms of Mussolini's auxiliary corps. Their hair was matted from weeks at sea, their faces stiff with suspicion. They squinted through the glare, expecting to see prison walls or snarling dogs. Instead, they saw cotton fields stretching to the horizon and a wooden sign painted in English they could not read. A few caught a word or two: "Welcome, prisoners of war." For months, these women had lived inside the war's unraveling. They had been nurses in bombed hospitals, radio clerks in collapsing command posts, or Red Cross attendants patching the wounded with rags. The surrender of Italy 11 days earlier had split their country, their army, even their loyalties. Some still whispered "Viva il Duce" under their breath. Others prayed no one would hear them speak his name. Now, their journey had ended in the heart of America, the land they had been taught to fear, a place described in propaganda leaflets as materialistic, godless, and cruel. The air smelled of hot iron, pine resin, and something sweet they couldn't identify, the scent of freshly baked bread from the camp kitchens. An American lieutenant shouted for them to form a line. His drawl dragged the English words like syrup, but his gestures were clear enough. "Line up. Single file. Keep moving." The women obeyed, clutching small bundles: combs, letters, a rosary or two. One nurse, perhaps 24, muttered to her companion, "We will be punished now. The Allies, they hate us." Another, older and more weary, whispered back, "At least they let us stand." A truck rattled past, spilling water from its barrels, and for a moment the women froze at the sight. Water, so ordinary, so plentiful here that it could be wasted on dust. Back home, water had been rationed, brown and tepid from broken pipes. Even in their fear, the contrast struck them like a silent insult. Inside the camp gate, U.S. guards stood in clean khaki, their faces young, sunburnt, and almost bored. No one shouted insults. No one spat. A bugle sounded somewhere, high, bright, and strangely cheerful. To the women's confusion, there were flowers planted near the barracks, marigolds glowing in the heat. It was as if the place hadn't yet realized it was supposed to be a prison. The narrator's tone lowers. What these women didn't know, what history almost forgot, is that the United States held over 50,000 Italian prisoners by late 1943, scattered from Virginia to California. Among them were a few thousand women, clerks, auxiliaries, volunteers, sent not for punishment but containment, processed under the same Geneva Convention that guaranteed soldiers humane treatment. But those words, humane treatment, meant little to anyone who had seen what hunger could do to dignity. The line moved slowly toward a wooden building with metal pipes running up its side. Steam leaked from vents. A white sign above the door read simply "decontamination." The word made some of the women stiffen. They'd heard stories. Rumors from German soldiers of chemical showers, punishment, humiliation. Their hearts beat faster. A woman at the front hesitated, whispering, "They are going to clean us like animals." Outside, Sergeant James Holloway of the U.S. Army Medical Corps ticked names off a clipboard. He was 23, from Arkansas, a former barber before the draft. To him, these women looked like ghosts, starved, dusty, too young for war. "Don't worry, ladies," he said, trying a half-smile they couldn't understand. "You'll feel better after." He waved one forward, gestured to the pipes. Inside, the air shimmered with heat. The narrator leans closer, almost whispering, "They expected punishment, not perfume." Each woman stepped inside as if into a tomb. The walls were tiled, clean, smelling faintly of metal. They were handed towels, small cakes of soap stamped U.S. Army issue, and told to wait. When the valves opened, hot water burst from the nozzles, hissing like released breath. The first screams were pure reflex, fear meeting surprise. Then laughter. Nervous at first, then wild and contagious. For the first time in years, real heat, real steam, real soap touched their skin. It was not a delousing, it was salvation. Outside, Holloway scratched his head as he heard the laughter through the walls. "Guess they like it," he said. One guard replied, "Wouldn't you? Beats a foxhole." When the women emerged, wrapped in towels and steam, their eyes were wide, cheeks flushed, hair dark and dripping. One reached for her friend's hand, whispering, "It smells like flowers." Another blinked at the light and murmured, "No one has ever washed me without shouting." The interpreter, an Italian-American corporal named DeLuca, heard her and smiled faintly. "Welcome to Texas," he said in their language. That night, the women were given plain cotton dresses, stew thick with beans, and coffee so strong it stung their tongues. They ate silently at first, afraid to believe it was real. One asked for permission to bless the meal. The guards nodded. Afterward, a few women began to sing, a low, nostalgic hum from the old country. The guards listened, pretending not to. By midnight, the camp lights glowed like small stars in the open prairie. In the barracks, the women lay on clean mattresses for the first time in months. Their skins smelled faintly of lemon-scented soap, their hair of unfamiliar American shampoo. Some wept softly, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable gentleness of it all. They had prepared for hate and found something disarming instead: courtesy. In the quiet, one nurse wrote a note in her diary, an entry that survives today in an Italian archive. "I thought America would strip us of our humanity. Instead, they gave it back, one shower at a time." The narrator pauses. It is here the story's conflict begins, not between nations, but between ideas. What happens when mercy replaces vengeance? When an enemy's kindness feels more unsettling than his cruelty? Outside, a desert wind moved through the camp fence, rattling tin cups and distant flagpoles. Sergeant Holloway stubbed his cigarette and looked toward the dark horizon. "We'll get 'em work tomorrow," he said to no one in particular. "But tonight, let 'em rest." He turned off the lights. Inside the barracks, a few women whispered prayers in Italian, others simply stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows of wooden beams with their eyes. Somewhere, a train whistle echoed, fading into the endless plains, carrying with it the last fragments of a Europe that no longer existed. The narrator's voice returns, quiet but edged with wonder. They came across an ocean expecting punishment. What they found was the first warm water in years, and a question that history still struggles to answer: why did the enemy show them mercy? The sound fades to the slow hiss of steam and a woman's soft laughter, almost like the ghost of a memory trying to survive the war. The next morning began not with a trumpet, but with the clang of metal buckets. Dawn seeped over the barbed wire, painting the camp in pale amber. The women were still groggy, still unsure if the previous night's meal had been a dream, when the guards called them to assemble again. Their names were read from a list. Slowly, each syllable dragged by American mouths not built for Italian vowels. One by one, they were directed toward a long wooden building with pipes running along its side. Steam drifted from its roof like a signal from some hidden world. The interpreter, Corporal DeLuca, stood at the door with a clipboard, his cap slightly askew. He spoke Italian with a Sicilian lilt, the kind that softened even bad news. "Routine check," he said. "4 lice for hygiene. You will shower, receive clean clothes. Nothing more." But his calm tone could not erase the women's unease. The word shower still carried a sting. They had heard stories, fragments of rumors smuggled through prison trains, about camps in Germany, where showers meant something else entirely. Inside, the air was thick with humidity, the floors slick from condensation. Sergeant Holloway, now stripped to his undershirt, supervised from behind a fogged window. He had been given orders: full delousing, standard medical inspection, issue garments and toiletries. Nothing about cruelty, nothing about comfort. Still, the women entered as though stepping toward judgment. They moved in small groups, clinging to one another. Some whispered prayers. A few tried to joke, thin, brittle humor masking fear. "At least they'll drown us clean," one muttered, earning nervous laughter. The line crept forward. The smell of soap grew stronger, mingling with metal and steam. Holloway gave the signal. The valves twisted open. A sharp hiss split the air. Then, hot water, rushing from every nozzle in a sudden roar. The women flinched, cried out, covered their heads. For a heartbeat, panic ruled the room. Then, as the heat settled over their skin, disbelief replaced fear. One woman, a nurse named Lucia, stood motionless, eyes closed, her hands trembling beneath the cascade. She hadn't felt warmth like this since Naples, before the bombs, before the hunger. Her hair, once caked with salt and dust, turned black again under the water. She caught her reflection in the wet tile, foreign, younger, almost alive. The narrator's tone softens. They came expecting humiliation. They found something even harder to endure, kindness. The water ran fragrant. American-supplied shampoo, faintly lemon and lavender, filled the air. Someone gasped. Another began to laugh, a sharp, bright sound that spread through the room like a contagion. Within minutes, the place was filled with laughter and splashing, with women shouting words of disbelief, joy, and something dangerously close to gratitude. Outside, Holloway paused his clipboard work and looked through the window. Steam blurred the glass. "What the hell's so funny?" he asked. DeLuca grinned. "They just realized it's hot water." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Ain't they had that before?" DeLuca shook his head. "Not like this. Not for years." The scene played out like an unintentional baptism. Every movement carried the awkward holiness of rediscovery. How to wash, how to breathe, how to exist without fear. A Red Cross aide, young, with gold hair under her cap, handed out towels and small bottles labeled shampoo, hair, citrus type A. To the Italians, the bottles looked absurdly luxurious, like something stolen from a dream. "I thought Americans were savages," said one woman in accented English, holding up her bottle. The aide smiled, not understanding, but the tone was gentle. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone gets one." There were tears too, quiet, unplanned. One matronly woman named Rosa broke down completely, pressing her wet hands to her face. "My son," she sobbed to no one. "He hasn't seen water like this since the war began." The guard nearby hesitated, unsure if he should comfort her. Instead, he offered a small gesture, a fresh towel, folded neatly. She took it like a relic. By mid-morning, the first group emerged from the building transformed. The women's hair gleamed in the sun, their faces clean, their postures lighter. They looked like themselves again, nurses, mothers, students, not prisoners of a collapsed empire. The guards tried not to stare, but even they felt the shift. Holloway, wiping his brow, muttered, "Never thought I'd see smiles in a POW camp." The narrator continues, balancing fact with poetry. According to U.S. Army records from 1943, each prisoner was entitled to 1 shower per week, 1 bar of soap per month, and medical inspection every 10 days. But statistics cannot measure what it meant to someone who had forgotten her own scent. For the women, it was not just cleanliness. It was dignity returned in steam and lemon-scented water. They lingered near the shower house afterward, hair wrapped in towels, speaking in low voices. Some dared to ask the guards questions. "Is this really America? Do they make this soap here?" One guard, too young to remember anything but war, laughed nervously. "Ma'am, it's standard issue. In the barracks, the new clothes waited, plain cotton dresses, khaki work skirts, shoes without holes. A small box beside each bunk contained a toothbrush, a comb, and a folded note written in English. Property of U.S. Army Quartermaster Service. It was as though the enemy had not just conquered them but adopted them. For a brief moment, suspicion melted into something dangerous, trust. That night, the women sang softly again, not out of duty but instinct. Their voices drifted beyond the fences, carried by the warm Texas wind. A few American soldiers stopped playing cards to listen. One whispered, "Never heard Italian sound that sad and that pretty at the same time." The narrator's voice slips into irony. Propaganda had promised these women that Americans were beasts. But beasts rarely hand out shampoo. Still, not everyone believed it would last. Some whispered that this was only the beginning of another kind of war, the war for their minds. "They want us to love them," said Lucia, toweling her hair. "So we forget who we were." Rosa replied softly, "Then maybe it is good to forget a little." In the mess hall that evening, coffee steamed from metal mugs, strong enough to make eyes water. The guards allowed seconds. Someone joked, "Perhaps tomorrow they give us perfume." The laughter that followed was not mocking but human, fragile, alive. When the lights dimmed, DeLuca walked the perimeter, his shadow stretching long along the wire. He looked back at the shower building, now silent. Steam still leaked faintly from its roof, curling into the moonlight like smoke from an invisible fire. He thought of the words his captain had said that morning, "The Geneva Convention keeps us human." Yet watching those women, he wondered if decency itself was the stronger weapon, that soft power that conquers without firing a shot. Inside the barracks, Lucia wrote another diary line, careful in the dark. "We laughed in captivity. That is the strangest miracle of all." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of soap and wet linen across the Texas plain. It mingled with dust, cotton, and the far-off whistle of another train arriving, new prisoners, new stories, new disbelief waiting to be washed clean. The narrator ends in a hush, the music fading to a heartbeat of steam. What they thought would break them instead began to mend them. But mercy, like war, has its consequences, and soon, both sides would learn how powerful simple kindness could be. By the third week, the camp no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of bread. The scent drifted through the barracks every morning, yeast, flour, and faint traces of sugar, carried on the warm Texas wind that rolled across the wire. It was an ordinary smell for the Americans, but for the Italian women it was something almost holy. In Italy, bread had become a memory rationed to crumbs. Here, loaves emerged golden from iron ovens, handed out by soldiers who called them rations, but gave them with something like pride. Lucia was among those assigned to the kitchen. Her hands, once steady over bandages and morphine vials, now kneaded dough under the guidance of a sergeant's wife named Margaret Holloway. Yes, the same surname as the medic. She had come to the camp to teach proper nutrition, as part of what the War Department called morale work. But to Lucia, she seemed like something else entirely, a woman untouched by war, whose hands smelled of flour and lotion instead of disinfectant. Margaret's voice carried a soft twang. "You stir too gentle," she said one morning, guiding Lucia's wrist. "You gotta fold it like you mean it. Bread don't rise if you don't give it courage." Lucia didn't understand all the words, but the rhythm was kind. She smiled shyly and pressed harder into the dough. All around, laughter bubbled from the women. They traded fragments of English, sugar, hot, thank you, and the Americans answered with patient grins. For a brief hour each morning, the war felt far away. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet tension lingered. Each loaf, each shower, each gesture of kindness carried an unspoken question. What did this kindness mean? Were they still prisoners, or something softer, guests in a moral experiment? The Geneva Convention called them protected persons, but the phrase hung strangely on their tongues. It sounded less like mercy and more like strategy. That afternoon, Lucia stood in line for her weekly shower again. Steam rose from the pipes, and the familiar scent of lemon shampoo filled the air. It no longer frightened anyone. The women chatted, combed their hair, even sang while waiting. The guards, embarrassed, pretended to look away. DeLuca, the interpreter, leaned against the wall, smoking. "You've all gone American now," he teased. Lucia shook her head. "No," she said carefully. "Just clean." Her accent made the word sound like clean, sharp and deliberate. The showers had become more than hygiene. They were ritual, the one place where the women could reclaim themselves. Each bottle of shampoo, each bar of soap felt like proof they existed beyond uniforms and politics. Rosa, the older nurse, said it best one evening as they folded laundry. "War dirties everything, your hands, your heart. Maybe this water washes more than skin." That night, as the women gathered for dinner, the smell of fresh bread met them again. But this time, something new appeared: butter. Real butter, pale and glistening under the mess hall lamp. Margaret Holloway had convinced the supply officer to spare a few pounds for the Italian girls. She served it herself, one small spoonful each, smiling as though it were Christmas. The women hesitated. To waste butter was unthinkable, to have it at all, a miracle. Lucia spread hers thinly over her bread, trembling slightly as it melted into gold. "It tastes," she whispered, "like peace." Across the room, Sergeant Holloway sat with his coffee, pretending not to watch. He'd learned their names by now: Lucia, Rosa, Anita, Julia, and though regulations forbade familiarity, he couldn't help it. They reminded him of his sisters, long gone to the cities for factory work. War had scattered everyone, he thought. But somehow, inside this fence, something was being gathered again. The narrator's voice drops low. In 1943, the U.S. War Department published reports praising Italian POW behavior: obedient, cooperative, almost grateful. But gratitude is not submission, it is recognition. Recognition of decency where one expected disdain. Still, rumors reached the camp. Rumors of German prisoners elsewhere, mistreated or shot, of Italian men forced into labor battalions. The women listened in silence, eyes down, knowing too well how fragile mercy could be. The kindness they received here might have been an exception, not the rule. Rosa found a tattered newspaper in the kitchen trash one morning. It carried a photograph of Mussolini, pale and defeated after his arrest. She showed it to Lucia, whispering, "Our Duce is a ghost now." Lucia stared at the image, then folded the paper carefully and used it to line her bread box. "Better ghosts than tyrants," she murmured. There were moments of humor too, tiny rebellions of spirit. One afternoon, the women discovered that the shampoo bottles, when emptied, made perfect vases for wildflowers. Soon, every barracks window filled with glass bottles holding sunflowers and sage. The guards laughed and nicknamed their row Perfume Alley. Lucia blushed at the name but secretly liked it. Even captivity, she realized, could bloom if watered with small grace. De Luca noticed the change. In his report to the camp commander, he wrote, "The women are adapting well. Their morale is high. They sing while working." He hesitated before adding another line: "They are beginning to see us not as enemies but as men." Yet not all Americans approve. A letter from a local Texan farmer reached the base, complaining that "these foreign women eat better than our own." The commander posted it on his desk, sighed, and said, "If kindness is our crime, we'll stand guilty." He ordered the cooks to bake extra loaves for the townsfolk that week, a quiet answer to resentment. For the prisoners, the gesture went unnoticed, but its meaning rippled through the camp. The war was not just fought in trenches. It was fought in kitchens, in showers, in the spaces where humanity tried to prove itself stronger than hate. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Lucia and Rosa sat outside the barracks, braiding wet hair and watching the sky. "When I go home," Rosa said, "I will tell them the Americans gave us shampoo and bread." Lucia smiled faintly. "They will not believe you." Rosa looked at her, eyes soft with something between sorrow and faith. "Then I will bring the bottle," she said. "Let them smell it. Truth has a scent." The narrator's voice lingers. War teaches men how to destroy. But sometimes it teaches women how to remember. That night, the camp's floodlights flickered against a sky heavy with autumn stars. Somewhere beyond the fence, an army truck rumbled, carrying new orders, new prisoners. Inside, the women slept in peace, unaware that soon their easy laughter and borrowed comfort would collide with the hard edge of war once more. Lucia's diary entry for that day would later read, The bread is soft. The butter melts quickly. I am beginning to forget how fear tastes. The camera of memory pans upward, across wire, steam, and night sky, until it catches the faint outline of a train arriving far down the track. The narrator's final whisper cuts through the hum of crickets. But peace, like bread, is fragile, and tomorrow, someone new will hunger for it. By spring of 1944, the barbed wire no longer looked like a prison fence. It looked like a border between two kinds of worlds. On one side, the women hung their washed dresses to dry on the wire, laughing as the wind stole a sleeve or a sock. On the other side, the guards leaned on their rifles, pretending not to smile. The war outside raged across Italy, but here in Texas, the war had turned strangely domestic. Less about enemies, more about chores, recipes, and quiet understanding. Lucia now spoke halting English, the kind born of work and imitation. She could say good morning, thank you kindly, and with a teasing grin, don't burn the bread again. She worked beside Margaret Holloway every day, and together they had built something more than routine, a fragile friendship stitched together by flour and empathy. Margaret often brought her small gifts. Sewing needles, a comb, sometimes a folded magazine picture of dresses, for after the war. In return, Lucia taught her Italian lullabies, words that Margaret couldn't pronounce but hummed anyway. The camp had softened in other ways too. The guards no longer flinched when the women sang in the evenings. They sometimes joined in, their low voices blending awkwardly with the lilting Italian hymns. The fence that once divided conqueror and captive had become a place of conversation, even laughter. And yet, for all the warmth, the question still lingered: how long could such peace last in the shadow of war? One morning, news arrived that German POWs would be transferred to a nearby facility. The atmosphere changed immediately. Trucks rattled through the gate carrying stern, wounded men in gray uniforms, faces sharp, eyes proud. The Italian women watched from the laundry yard. They look like statues, Rosa said softly. Stone doesn't melt. Lucia nodded. Nor forgive. Later that week, 2 German officers refused to work alongside the Italians, calling them traitors. When word spread, tension crackled through the camp. The Americans, determined to keep order, separated the groups, but the insult had already done its work. For the first time in months, the women's laughter vanished. They sat silent at dinner, staring at their food, the steam from their bowls curling upward like fading hope. That night Lucia couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, looking at the floodlights tracing the wire, and felt the ache of distance, between herself and home, between Italy's shame and America's mercy. Her loyalty had become a puzzle she couldn't solve. Was she still Italian if the people who treated her kindly wore enemy uniforms? The narrator's tone lowers. War did not end when the guns fell silent. It ended when people learned which parts of themselves to keep. Days passed. Then came Easter Sunday. Margaret entered the barracks early, carrying a basket covered in a white cloth. The women gathered, curious. She lifted the cloth to reveal hot rolls, dyed eggs, and a small chocolate bar cut into pieces. "A gift," she said simply, "from the wives in town." The women stared in disbelief. Rosa crossed herself. Lucia, unable to speak, reached for one of the colored eggs, blue like the spring sky. That evening, the chapel tent was full. Italians, Americans, even a few Germans sat side by side as a chaplain read a verse about forgiveness. The wind rustled through the open flaps, carrying the scent of wildflowers. When the hymn began, the voices blended imperfectly, English words and Italian syllables tangled together until they became one uncertain but beautiful sound. Holloway stood at the back, hat in hand, his eyes wet. Afterward, as the camp quieted, Lucia approached him with DeLuca to translate. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "we thank you. For the bread. For the water." She searched for the next word, then found it in her own tongue. "For dignity." Holloway nodded, his voice rough. "It ain't charity, miss. Just decency. Everyone deserves that." For weeks, the memory of that night stayed with the camp. The guards spoke more softly. The women worked with lighter hearts. The Germans, seeing this strange coexistence, kept their distance, perhaps out of envy. And somewhere between routine and grace, the line between prisoner and host blurred completely. DeLuca wrote in his final report, "They no longer call this a camp. They call it a village. But peace is a guest that never stays long." In July, an order came from Washington. All Italian prisoners deemed cooperators were to be repatriated or transferred for labor support. The news struck like thunder. Some women cheered at the thought of going home. Others wept quietly, afraid to return to ruins and judgment. Lucia found Margaret outside the kitchen that evening, drying her hands. "We go soon," Lucia said softly. Margaret looked at her, eyes shining but tired. "I know," she whispered. "The war's moving on, honey. But it don't mean goodbye forever." She pressed something into Lucia's palm, a small bottle of the lemon shampoo they both loved. "For when you get home," she said. "So you don't forget that clean start." The gesture undid her. Lucia hugged her tightly, something neither of them had dared before. Neither spoke for a long moment. Around them, the world smelled of bread, soap, and tears. Departure day came under a heavy sky. The women lined up by the gate once more, just as they had that first morning months ago. But this time their faces were fuller, their clothes pressed, their hair shining. They looked like people again. The Americans saluted as the trucks rolled out. Margaret waved her handkerchief. Holloway stood beside her, silent, jaw set tight. Lucia looked back until the camp disappeared behind the dust. She opened her palm. The small shampoo bottle gleamed in the sunlight like a relic of another life. The narrator's voice deepens. History does not record every kindness. It records battles, treaties, flags. But sometimes the quietest moments, bread shared, hair washed, a name spoken gently, reshape the meaning of war. Months later, back in a ravaged Italy, Lucia would unpack her belongings in a half-collapsed home. She would set the bottle on the windowsill, beside a loaf of coarse bread. Neighbors would ask about her time in America, expecting tales of hardship. She would only say, "They treated us like people." That was enough. Years passed. Letters arrived from Texas, one from Margaret, another from DeLuca. Each carried photographs, smiling faces, a camp gate, marigolds blooming where the wire once stood. The narrator's voice softens, almost fading. When the war ended, the camp was dismantled. The buildings were sold, the fences cut down. Only the ground remembered where laughter had once defied the logic of hate. In the final image, the camera lingers on an empty shower room, sunlight falling through a broken window. Dust drifts through the air, glowing like ghosts of steam. A single towel hangs from a hook, motionless. The narrator whispers, "They came as prisoners. They left as witnesses, to a victory that required no surrender, only compassion." A pause. Then, the voice returns one last time, gentle, deliberate, and human. If stories like this remind you that kindness can change history, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us, what small mercy would you never forget? Because sometimes, the smallest acts wash away the deepest wars.